Hi, and welcome to this session about Microsoft Graph and SharePoint Framework under steroids with Azure Functions. My name is Vincent Biret. I'm living in Montreal, Canada. I work for Tutulead, who is a consulting company based out of Toronto. On my day-to-day, I do mostly Office 365 and Azure development, and I'm also Office servers and services MVP. If you want to reach me out, here's my Twitter account, my blog, and my other contact means. So, who is this session for? Um, Mostly for developers, I would say, but also for deciders and architects who would like to know where the technology is going in terms of building projects, building solutions, and where you should invest and all those kind of things. Today, we'll talk about lots of things actually. The first one being the SharePoint framework. I'm not sure if everybody has had a chance yet to play with it and to know how it works and what are the key concepts. So we'll make sure everybody's on page for that. And then we'll talk about Azure Functions. What are those? How they work? What concepts do they introduce? And what do they bring in terms of value? The next thing we're going to talk about is Azure Active Directory, because we need to build solutions that are secure, and we need to know which people we're talking to and that are using our solutions, and AAD is going to play a key role in those kind of scenarios. Of course, we could not have that session without talking about the Microsoft Graph V1 API for Microsoft workloads. And a good session would not be good without a demo at the end of the session. And finally, we'll have time to say goodbye, ask a few questions, and so on. So let's dive in. Let's talk about the new stack. So I hope this is a set of slides that you have seen already. Just a quick show of hands, please, to begin with. Thank you. So we were used to a certain set of tools when, as SharePoint developers, we were building solutions, and those tools have translated to a new set of tools, and I'll take a few minutes to make sure everybody's on the same page. Before, back in the days where we had full trust solutions, so code running inside of SharePoint, or even provider hosted add-ins, or sandbox solutions. When we wanted to start a new project, the first thing we would do is start Visual Studio, do find new project and answer a few questions, and we would be ready to start developing. Most of the time, the development language we were using back then was C#, because we were doing backend development, and JavaScript was far from being what it is today back then. To build, package, deploy those kind of solutions, we used a tool which is actually embedded into Visual Studio, which is called MS Build. And some of us were also doing unit tests with MS Test and so on and so forth. It's always better to, before jumping into coding something, look if there are any other existing solutions that are already in place that you can leverage. And NuGet was actually, well, is still today a great solution to bring third-party libraries into our solution and keep them updated and package those and so on and so forth. And lastly, if we wanted to debug and run local code quickly, most of the time we used IIS Express, which was leveraging the .NET Framework runtime and so on and so forth. So while those tools are very important for backend scenarios, they don't necessarily very well translate for front-end development. And we'll see that Microsoft has made a big bet on front-end first solutions, and then you can extend with other back-end solutions. But for the front-end part, of things, those are the set of tools. So if you want to start a project and create a new project, and what we call scaffold the project, one of the very first tools you'll be using is Yeoman. Yeoman is basically I would not say a bot, but more like an assistant to help you answer a bunch of questions and make sure your project is structured properly like it's supposed to be, depending on your scenario. The language will be writing code, so we could be writing pure JavaScript. However, that can be fastidious, and because JavaScript is still lacking, in my opinion, a few features that would make it an enterprise language, programming language. So Microsoft has been investing for years and years with the open source community and other actors in the industry on that language called TypeScript. And it's actually just a superset of the existing JavaScript, and often, not all the time, features that are introduced in TypeScript make it a few years after into the specification of the newer versions of JavaScript. Gulp is just a task orchestrator. It's another open source solution out there that helps you put one task after another in order to change sequences and make sure that everything happens properly in the right order and so on and so forth. And it will mostly be used in our case for any kind of operation between linting, so controlling that the code is in a good format, to building, to running unit tests, to packaging, to even deploying. If you want to know more about those things, I encourage you to go to my other session about the SharePoint Framework and DevOps scenarios. NPM, Node Package Manager, is the equivalent of Nugget. Basically, there is a huge ecosystem, and including Gulp, including Human, out there, of open source solutions that are contributed by hundreds of thousands of developers all around the world. And the idea of NPM is to be able to grab those packages and incorporate those into your solutions. Kind of what Nugget was doing in a bit of a different way. There are other package dependencies management systems out there, like Bower and Yarn and so on, but this is the one Microsoft is the most investing on currently. And finally, Node.js. So Node.js does a lot of things. It is first and foremost the ability to run JavaScript outside of a browser. So the idea is that JavaScript was originally founded for the web and for having a browser context, so somebody using a window and clicking all around the place. However, it was not very good idea to limit it to that. So Node.js can act as just a runtime for JavaScript, kind of what the .NET framework is, but because of NPM packages and extensions and all the history, it also can act as a server, a command line interface, and a bunch of other things that will help you interact with your projects and build them out and test them out. So the way this is going to work in practice is the first thing you're going to have to do is install a few things like Node and Visual Studio Code, hopefully, and so on and so forth. And once you have done that, the first thing you want to install is the SharePoint Human generator. Well, first Human and then the SharePoint Human generator. So it's basically a package that contains all the questions that it's going to ask you and all the templates that it has available to generate your project. So this is basically what it is, right? Once you have installed that generator, well, you can write yo at Microsoft/SharePoint and answer a few questions to make sure that your project is scaffolded depending on your scenario. And then the things you're going to do is actually edit your code, test it out, and so on. So here it says web parts, but now the SharePoint Framework is not limited anymore to web parts. You also have the extensions and the app customizations as well. That are two other ways to interact with a modern experience. But the idea is just the same. You have a set of different sets of components that you write some logic to retrieve data, to display that data, to interact with the user, whatever you're trying to do. And hopefully you can write also unit tests. One of the great things about the SharePoint Framework, it has a local workbench. Even though not everything can be tested against the local workbench, at least the one parts can. So that means that To do web parts development today with a SharePoint framework, you don't need a full SharePoint installation on your machine. I don't know if you remember those huge laptops SharePoint developers used to carry around, or even a connectivity to SharePoint Online to some extent. You just need an internet connection and a light machine. So you do that a couple of times, test out your code, make sure it reacts properly, and once you've done that, the next logical step is to package and deploy your solution to SharePoint and test it against a real SharePoint to see if in the real case it works well. Hopefully that's going to be the case. The next step is to deploy things to CDN. So now that's a bit more transparent step, as SharePoint is doing that for you in some cases. So you don't have to, it depends on the cases and how you deploy things, but basically a CDN is a content delivery network. The idea is to optimize performances and distribution of assets by distributing those to lots of different places and serving those to the closest endpoint to the user. And SharePoint Office 365 2 years ago delivered an Office 365 CDN that's already part of your subscription. You don't have to pay extra for it. And the idea is to make SharePoint faster and have a better experience for the users. And yeah, once that is done, all the packaging and deployment is done, you're ready to run into production, basically. So hopefully that brought everybody on page on the SharePoint framework, and hopefully this is something you've already seen, so it's why I'm not spending too much time on that. What are the benefits of having a SharePoint framework? So one of the commitments of Microsoft is that it's not only a third-party extension model, but also a first-party extension model. So when you talk to the teams at Microsoft, and I had the chance to be at the MVP Summit a couple of weeks ago, they tell you that yes, there is a team in charge of building the SharePoint framework, but that team doesn't only answer to the people outside of Microsoft, it also answers to people inside of Microsoft. So teams like the OneDrive team, teams like the SharePoint team, and so on, they use that extension model to build the products. So which means that they don't have any kind of magical trick to make something work that doesn't work for you, that you cannot and limits you, or they don't have more support or anything like that from the extension teams. So hopefully that should bring a better experience, development experience, and of course a better usability experience for our users. It's open source based. Not all of it is open source, because you have to understand that some bits of the SharePoint framework sit in SharePoint server, and that's always going to be here because you need to have a platform that supports it, and that's part of the product, and that's the intellectual property of Microsoft, and so on. But a lot of tools that are being used as part of the SharePoint framework, things like Webpack, things like NPM, things like Gulp, all of that is open source. So if something is broken, it's easy to find at least documentation, to go talk to somebody that might have a solution to fix it, or to even fix it yourself in some cases. And contributions are welcome. Because it's open source, as I said, more examples, more community support, and for the deciders and CIO in the room, bigger developer community. I know for a lot of companies, it's been a struggle to hire and find SharePoint developers. I'm not saying that those are obsolete now. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is for entry-level solutions that don't necessarily require a lot of knowledge of SharePoint, it's going to be much easier to find a developer because it's all based on web standards. So any modern web developer should be familiar with what's happening with SharePoint Framework and able at least to help with bringing a solution to life, basically. And it also provides you with a bigger choice of tools. So that comes with two sides. On one side, well, you have more freedom, you can do more things, right? But on the other side, sometimes it can be overwhelming and confusing. Because those are a lot of new concepts, a lot of new things that traditional SharePoint developers are not used to dealing with. And this is something you have to get familiar with. And I already said it, but the footprint of a SharePoint framework, meaning the machine I have to carry around, is much smaller because it's all web-based and doesn't require full installation of SharePoint, and it's much smaller and funnier to play with actually. All right. So if there are no questions, I'll move to the next section. Azure Functions. Who has heard about the term serverless? Okay, that's good. So a long time ago in a galaxy far away, and I hope I'm not going to get any copyright issue with that, we used to live in an era where the cloud wasn't born yet. So that what that effectively would mean is anytime you wanted to build a solution, you had to deal with even physical constraints like, okay, I need that kind of machine that's going to be this powerful, that's going to use this much electricity, that means a UPS, a backup, and so on. That's going to need cooling, backup, but also things like physical space in the rack. Sometimes I've seen projects being delayed because, well, the data center was just not big enough anymore, right? And so that would bring a lot of headaches and slow down a lot deliveries of solutions to the business. Then came around IaaS in very early forms, like things like public hosting companies that had machines available that you could rent, to also clusters of virtualized hardware, to actually very early clouds that are available today, things like the cloud services on Azure way back then. And that solved a few questions that we had to ask ourselves. No more questions about electricity, physical space, and so on, but we still have had questions around backup, provisioning the new VM, deployment, monitoring, the load balancing and handling load increase and decrease and so on and so forth, having tolerance to network faults and so on. So it made things easier. It made bringing new solutions easier, but still a lot of questions around. So the next logical thing is PaaS, product as a service, that we use a lot as a developer. So instead of worrying about an OS and having patching and so on and so forth, we just would have to care about what different product we need, or services, let's call it this way because there are services anyways, what kind of different Lego bricks we need in our solution, bundle those together, hopefully guess properly the right amount we need in terms of service SKU and scale and so on. And even if we didn't guess right, we could always change it in later. That's okay. And that solved a lot of issues and questions. Still, we had some questions like how do I deploy my code? Who monitors the application? Who monitors the service? And some OS questions as well and so on. And then became, a couple of years ago, serverless. So some of you might have heard about Amazon Lambdas. There are other competitors in the ecosystem. But the only questions you have to care about is, what am I trying to build? Like your business solution. How do I deploy my code to my service? And how big my service should be. That's all you care about. And even how big my service should be is not so much of a question anymore, because some plans are consumption, so it technically can scale quote unquote indefinitely and support the load of your application. Of course, they will charge you for that, but that's the counterpart. So how do you define a serverless? First and foremost, you have an abstraction of servers and services to some extent. One of the very definition is it scales either up, down, in, out instantly. When we're used to periodic scales for other services, things like once every hour for some web apps, or for some VMs once every couple of hours, and so on and so forth. The idea is serverless services should scale in a matter of seconds, and that's about it, right? And the billing is right, it's super close to what you're using by a second, right? So we actually, in case of Azure, we'll talk about that later, but they bill you per gigabytes you're using per second. So the benefits, well, those are less things to care about, right? So you focus on delivering your application and on the business logic, and all of that makes it that your time to market is much smaller than the traditional time to market. And let's be clear about something. Unless you're working for a giant editor company like Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, and so on and so forth, right? Your only real value as a developer in a company is to bring more business value and help either the business units being more efficient or reach more customers or do things better and so on and so forth. And you can only do that if you focus on the business value and not on the technical things all around that, right? We're used to spending most of our times debugging or deploying or provisioning stuff. All of that is actually waste for the company. Those are sub-activities that support one activity, which is bringing value to the business. So now let's talk about Azure Functions, which are Microsoft's answer to the serverless ecosystem. The way you're going to start your journey is, well, of course, you have to go to portal.azure.com, and we'll see that later during the demo phase. And they'll ask you to first pick a language, pick a trigger, so what's going to start your function and start the code. You can add some inputs and outputs, so connections to databases, to storage, to other things, and we'll see that later. And then you can just go ahead and write the business logic code, right? And that's about your day. Hopefully you do some testing and deployment, but you don't have to. There's very simple portal experience for the Azure Functions that actually works well, even though it can seem a little bit messy at the beginning. And the last thing is you scale your service, right? And even that you don't actually need to do it because again, there's a consumption plan that's more expensive than if you plan your workload, but still that's gonna scale quote unquote indefinitely and handle your load. So you don't actually need to plan it. And yeah, the last thing is you're production ready. You don't have anything else to do. So that's much, much, much faster than a traditional workflow. Talking about connectors, and connectors bring triggers, but also input and output bindings. Azure Functions already supports dozens of those. I've listed some of them here, things like webhooks or HTTP triggers, so any kind of other application or other solution or even user calling your application. But you also have a lot of things that are running into Azure, like the blob storage, Cosmos DB, even Subs notifications, and so on. But also third parties like on the far left at the bottom, SendGrid, that's for email communications, and on the far right, Twilio, that's for text messages, phone calls, and stuff like that. And the most important one for me is the Microsoft Graph one, because that brings a technical solution which is super powerful with integration with your business data and your collaboration, messaging, and so on data. And that unlocks infinite scenarios that are super interesting for companies. In terms of languages support, there are a couple of those. Here, like C#, JavaScript, F#, Python, Java, Shell, Bash, PowerShell, TypeScript, and PHP. Some of those are still not supported in production yet. The ones supported in production are actually C#, JavaScript, and F# at the moment, but they are making progress every day on that. In terms of scale and SKUs, you have two options. Either you leverage an app service plan, so the same thing as the web apps, and keep in mind that Azure Functions are built on top of Azure Web Apps that have been here for years now, and Web Jobs that have been here for years. So it's it's production ready for the most part, and those come from with a hosting plan. So you basically say to Microsoft, I'm going to need something approximately this big. Maybe I will scale, maybe I won't, but this is the size I need, and the level of service I need with that, right? And that comes with a cost, right? And you have to manage scale. So if you reach the like boundaries of your SKU and your plan and so on, well, at some point it might throttle or say, hey, I cannot answer anymore, and so on and so forth. So you are responsible for changing the SKU if you reach the boundaries. But within those boundaries, your service is going to scale automatically. Or you can go with a consumption plan, and the cost is based on numbers of executions, how long do they last, and how much memory you use. And they invented a new unit for that, gigabyte seconds. Keep in mind that the consumption plan is, especially for bigger workloads, is usually more expensive, but you don't have to care about things, right? So it makes things a lot easier. In terms of toolings, you have, in my opinion, two main options that are available for professional development. You can, of course, start in the browser. There is an editing experience to create your functions and to build them from the portal, and you can write code from the portal and so on and so forth. But besides that, you can use a Visual Studio 2017 with the Azure SDK, or you can use the Azure Function CLI with Visual Studio Code, and both are free and open source. So if you have some challenges getting some Visual Studio 2017 licenses, it's not so big a concern. So let's talk about Azure Active Directory right now. So I don't know how many of you have challenges with identity, authentication, authorization, and so on and so forth. Those are really hard problems because they play with different constraints that are, well, I want something to be secured, right? So it has to be secured. I'm not necessarily in control of all the environment this is working on, right? So it cannot be a simple solution by design. My users can be on different devices, geographical locations, doing tons of different things. My administrators can have different views on different things, might have government policies and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, there's us, the developers, trying to figure out something to make everything work properly. So the good news is, even though it's still complex, Azure Active Directory helps a lot with all those concerns by giving control to users and administrators and policy administrators and so on and so forth, but providing us with SDKs, tools, documentation to integrate all that power directly in our applications and solutions. And keep in mind that this is also the first-party identity solution and service for all the Office 365 workloads. So anything that runs into Office 365 behind the scenes actually relies on AAD for all those concerns. It can store users, of course, but also groups, applications, and a bunch of other items. And it provides many capabilities from an administrative perspective, things like SSO, federation, synchronization of directories, things like enforced security with multi-factor authentication, geofencing, and also increasing productivity by automating some administrative tasks, things like self-service password reset, B2B and B2C scenarios, and so on and so forth. The basic principles are fairly easy. As a developer, when you're using AAD for your application, your user tries to access either your app or your API. By default, he's not authenticated against that, so he's gonna get redirected by your code or the SDKs you're leveraging to AAD using OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.0 to get whole bunch of tokens, identity token to, well, get the identity of a user, access token to access your API, refresh token in some scenarios to persist that access, well, to renew that access token on longer period of times, and so on and so forth. And when he or she has that token, you can present it to your API, and that API can, or doesn't have necessarily, depends on what scenarios you're covering, but leverage that token to ask for another token to present to SharePoint and the Microsoft Graph. It really depends on your scenarios. There are lots of different flows between the consent, grant, on behalf, and so on and so forth that can be leveraged here. But the key part here is, as developers, we do not want to store username and passwords, right? Because it's been a disaster over the last couple of years with so many leaks and breaches and so on and so forth. So we are already holding so much sensitive data. If we can well, delegate one aspect of that, awesome for us. And as users, actually, they don't want to have an extra set of username and password. They want to have like corporate SSO and not care about things, right? That's about it. So this is why you absolutely want to rely on that, and also because it will by de facto provide you access to those different APIs that Microsoft is providing as the user. So there is currently a huge confusion around ADAL, MSAL, and a bunch of other things. So I'm hoping here to bring a bit of clarity if you want to start a new project tomorrow, because this was painful to me or some of the developers on my team. So I'm trying to bring the good words out there and help you jumpstart faster. So there are two libraries called ADAL and MSAL. ADAL for Active Directory Authentication Library, and MSAL for Microsoft Authentication Library. And they both talk to Azure Active Directory. So that can be confusing to begin with. Why do we have two libraries to do the same thing, right? The reason is because there are two endpoints, two sets of endpoints in AAD, a V1 and a V2. And as you can suspect, well, ADAL is currently talking to the V1 and MSAL is talking to the V2. And we'll talk later about what are the differences between those endpoints. But keep in mind that MSAL is still in preview, technically, if you look at the packages and so on and so forth, but it's commercially supported because there are certain things that big companies, or maybe even you, are doing or need to do that are only available in V2, and that are, the endpoints are production workload, but that are, like, they have to use MSAL basically, right? So it's really important before you start any project to look closely at authentication and authorization, see what exactly we're trying to do. Am I trying to act? Do I have an API? Do I want to secure the API? Do I want to access other Microsoft APIs as part of my API? If yes, do I want also to be able to access whenever the user is not actually using his computer or device or whatever? Or is it okay if I just access it whenever he's using the whole solution? Also, do I want to access everybody's data or just specific users' data, and so on and so forth, right? All those questions are really are important to determining which flows, authentication flows, you are going to need, and that's going to determine which versions of the endpoints you can leverage, and that's going to tell you which library you can use basically. So around the detail for V2. V2 brings lots of things. First and foremost, a unified authentication between MSID, so accounts like your Hotmail accounts, or MSN. I don't know if you remember MSN Messenger, or your Xbox account, basically the personal sphere of Microsoft services, and AAD, which is the professional or educational sphere of Microsoft. So the idea is, if I'm a user, if I'm using OneDrive personally, and also for my as an employee, your solution should only need to write the code once and be able to leverage data wherever it sits, right? That's the vision of Microsoft. We still have a long way to accomplish it. Dynamic scopes. So the idea of those is, as opposed to when you install the application, ask for your consent at the same time for, I don't know, reading your profile, sending emails, reading your stuff in OneDrive all at once, which can be scary when you try a new application that don't you know the source and the provider and so on and so forth, especially with what happened recently with Facebook and so on, right? Is that dynamic scopes consent will allow you as a developer to say, hey, I just want the profile for now. And then when they click on a feature that needs something else, you can, hey, to do that, that's cool, but I need that additional consent as well, and so on and so forth, right? So this is something new they bring. Client credential flow. So the idea is your application can act as a service account and do impersonification without the context of a user. So that's very important for background processes. And on behalf flow, the idea is that your API can relay the authentication context to an application and present it. For example, if I build an add-in for, let's say, Excel, the client, well, the client, web API, whatever, currently it's super hard to differentiate. Is it the user? Is it the user plus the application? Is it Excel itself doing the action? All that has a lot of confusion, and that endpoint, that flow and endpoints supporting those are intended to help with that. Limitations, so things that V2 doesn't have yet and that V1 already has. The numbers of secrets, so depending on your scenarios, you'll be leveraging secrets to authenticate your application, and the V2 has a set of limitations around that. Securing APIs, today there's other limitations around that as well. Today also the V2 applications are not showing up in the Azure portal. It can be confusing, right? You have two experiences, two portals, and it's not well integrated with the enterprise management experience. No wildcard redirects for URLs, so you cannot have, well, URLs with wildcards for redirecting the user during the authentication process, which is super painful when you're doing any kind of SharePoint solution, because you want to put star.sharepoint.com for all the tenants and not like each and every tenant, right? And some resources are not compatible today with V2 endpoints. I'm pointing at SharePoint and other things like that. I hope that helps bring a bit of clarity. After the session, I'll be uploading my slides on my SlideShare. There are tons of links I put in the comment section, so I will encourage you, like if you're interested in struggling with that today, I will encourage you either to come and talk to me at the end of the session, or well, download those slides and click on those links. All right, moving on to the Microsoft Graph. So, the idea of the Microsoft Graph is to have one single API endpoint to talk to all or most, at least, of the Microsoft Online 365 workloads. It's getting there, and they made tremendous progress so far, and this is why you should care. It's basically this is a screen cap of me clicking. Hey, PowerPoint is not helping. Me clicking and scrolling through the changes over the last year. That screen capture is 1 minute long. I don't think we'll have time to look at everything, but this tells a lot about all the investments Microsoft is making into that API, and this is one of the big factors why you should care. But let's back up a little bit. Why should you care as well about Microsoft Graph? Well, 90% of the most important companies use Office 365 today, right, to some extent. And today there are 100 million monthly active users, so 100 million people that go and use Office 365 during the month, and as part of Office 365 paying subscriptions. So those are actually customers and not just demo tenants. And today the graph already has 1 trillion objects, which can be emails, events, calendar, user files, you name it, whatever, right? But it's already a huge store of a vast amount of data, basically. When we talk about workloads, we have a few ones that are already here that you might recognize, some that don't even have logos yet. So things like OneDrive, Teams, Excel, SharePoint, Exchange, and so on and so forth, AAD, OneNote, and so on and so forth. But things also like Intune for on any admin policies and so on and so forth. Things also like Project Roam. So I don't know if you watched the videos and the demos about Project Roam and what we're trying to achieve, but it's basically we're trying to build a seamless experience between the PC and the desktop and any form factor you might have, like a phone or a tablet. And the idea is you walk in, you just out of from the metro, you just got home, right? You're reading this article up, you can send it to your computer to continue reading. You're listening to some music, you can send it to your Xbox to continue playing it, and so on and so forth, right? So there is a huge commitment for Microsoft, and this is, to me, this is one of the reasons you should care. And also it helps with the citizen developer movement, right? Everything is an API, everything is documented, so if you want to build something on top of it, well, it's right here, right? You don't have to dig and do some retro engineering and so on and so forth. In terms of capabilities, there are different capabilities that are available on top of the data and so on. The first one being webhooks. So the idea of a webhook is to subscribe to some data updates. So things like an email was sent, things like an email was deleted, any kind of things like that. And when you subscribe to that, and we'll demonstrate that later on, your API is going to be notified with some data to, well, go back and look what was exactly the change, and you'll be able to take actions programmatically. OData. So OData is a standard that's been around for a while now, and that allows you to do some data manipulation, things like selecting, filtering, projecting data, and so on and so forth. Also counting, paging, batching the requests, and so on. It's a very helpful standard, and the graph has some different levels of support depending on which endpoints you're talking to. Delta API. So the idea of, hey, last time I checked was with this change token, effectively like at this period of time, point in the time, and what's changed since the last time I checked, right? This is super useful for scenarios like synchronizing data, like updating things, and so on and so forth. And the open and schema extensions. So those are two ways to effectively store your own data into the Microsoft Graph and to extend the metadata that's already available there. So things like think about things like adding some business data on top of a meeting, adding some kind of reference between a document and your archiving system, all those kind of scenarios, right? In terms of SDKs, you have, of course, C#, JavaScript, TypeScript, Python again, Java, PHP, Ruby, Android, and iOS. So most of those are the same ones as Azure Functions, and we'll see that later. But some of those are oriented for mobile developers as well. Keep in mind that Android and iOS are still in preview today. They are, as well as Java. So they are not to be used for production workloads. So this is where the fun comes. Now that we talked about all the different technologies we're leveraging and why they make sense, let's see those technologies not as things that are apart, but as things that can be together and play together. So one of the native, and it's still V2 preview, very early, so I would encourage you to try it, but not at all to build any production workload with that, are the native integrations between Azure Functions and Microsoft Graph. So automatically you have the ability to say, I want to trigger or to add an input or an output for my Azure function that I'm building on top of Microsoft Graph data, like things like Excel tables, OneDrive files, Outlook, Exchange effectively, authentication, also all the webhooks, well, some of the webhooks. Now let's talk about Azure Functions and the SharePoint Framework. So Since version 1.4.1, which is only available for SharePoint Online, SharePoint Framework has capabilities to talk to AAD to get tokens and so on and so forth, and leverage those tokens either to talk to a custom API or to talk to some secured, the graph actually. So you can effectively build an Azure function, secure it via AAD, leverage the SharePoint Framework capabilities to get a token for that function, and call your API that has been built in a couple of minutes in Azure Functions. And that's hopefully going to scale indefinitely. All right. So let's talk about our demonstration. And I know this is close to the end of the session. So the need is we want to encourage people to have better interactions with one another. We want to make sure that when they send out emails, we will scan those and make sure that they send nice emails or they receive nice emails with a nice sentiment in the text, right? And we want to display a web part that's gonna display their score and see how nice they are and what impact they have on the company. So of course this is gonna leverage different workloads. First, the Exchange one, right? The user is gonna send and receive a bunch of emails. And second, the Microsoft Graph, because things are going to be happening in Exchange, that's gonna reflect in the Microsoft Graph, and that's gonna interact with Azure Functions. Things like we're going to be using things like webhooks to trigger our functions and to go get the data and to process it. Once the user goes to the portal, they will display SharePoint Framework web part, which is also going to talk to our Azure Functions to get the data and get the scoring data and so on and so forth. Our customer today is the CIA, the Canadian Immersion Agency, and the goal of this agency is to make sure that everybody is nice to one another and they monitor communications for that purpose. All right, and let's jump right into the demonstration. So one of the very first thing I want to show you is the Azure Function experience. So here I'm in the portal for Microsoft Azure, simply, and I have two Azure Functions. And the reason why is because the webhooks, when they're called by the graph, has to be available anonymously. So they need not to have any kind of authentication layer on top of that. And this is standard practice across webhooks in the industry and the standard and so on and so forth. So I have a first function here that just handles the webhook payloads, right? And one of the things it will do is just get the requests from the graph, and as soon as possible send it back to the service bus. The service bus being a messaging infrastructure service that allows you to send out messages and then collect those at the other end, basically. So that's not the most interesting function. The most interesting function here is this one, actually. This one has a couple of functions in the function service. One which is the get user. That's the one that the SharePoint Framework web part is going to be calling to get the score and the average of the user over the last communications. And another one which is core email. This is effectively the one that is plugged to the service bus and going to receive all the notifications from the one receiving the webhooks, call the scoring function, and add some data on the email so they can later on be leveraged by the get user function. How did I do all of that? The first thing you have to consider very first and not forget is here on the settings you have to make sure that you take care of CORS considerations. So CORS stand for cross-origin resource sharing requests, and the idea is that the browser won't allow your code on JavaScript to talk to a different domain name unless that domain name says it's okay, to avoid any kind of script injection being used to DDoS other services, basically. So it's very important to configure that, and then here I put my SharePoint website. The second thing that I did, if you click in platform features, and platform features, again, this is all relying on Azure Web Apps and Azure Web Jobs. So you will see a lot of options here that are actually coming from there. But one of the things here you want to configure is the authentication layer. So my application is effectively going to check that our like any kind of HTTP call made to this API is actually coming with a bearer token, effectively an access token that is valid for this application in Azure AD. And that was declared again in Azure AD in the Azure portal. Here at a central location. One of the things I did declaring this application is I also requested other permissions from Microsoft Graph, so I can do other things like reading emails, like subscribing to webhooks and so on and so forth. So this can be leveraged to access more data in the graph as I get a token coming from the user. So that's another thing. Once we have infrastructure in place, so our application is going to understand cores, it's going to be authenticated, all the calls are going to be authenticated. The last thing you need to do is configure any kind of other settings you might have, things like the tenant, things like the service bus connection, and so on and so forth, and you're effectively ready to use that. One very useful feature of the Azure Functions when you're debugging and kind of setting up the service is to leverage the monitor tab or link. And you can, even though this is not instantaneous, that gives you an idea on when was your function called the last time and so on and so forth. That's the first piece. And I didn't write the code in the Azure portal. I could have done, but I'm not a big fan of that. But I used instead the Visual Studio here. And as you can see, I have standard Visual Studio projects with dependencies, with code, and so on and so forth. And here you can find my different functions, like the one scoring emails, the one handling the webhook, the one getting the user, and so on and so forth. So the first thing here, so the handle webhook is actually not that interesting. It's just getting some JSON data and putting it into a service bus, so nothing super interesting to say. One thing you have to be super careful with is when you subscribe to the webhook, the graph is going to call your webhook to validate that it's actually working and it's not something dead behind the scenes. And you have to answer to it with that validation key and a 200 OK. So otherwise, your graph is gonna say, "Oh no, this is something dead," or you don't own it, because you could also be using that feature to DDoS our external stuff. And it's not actually going to create your webhook subscription. Once that particular case is handled, you can do all your business logic here later on. The most interesting one in my opinion is the score one here. So keep in mind that all those notifications coming from the webhook are actually passed here with the service bus. And for each of those, what I do is actually get the user, get his messages. So that line of code effectively gives me access to the messaging of the user, and one specific one with that message ID, and I get that. And once I get that, I use the score function here, the get score function, to make sure that I call connective services. So this is another service of Microsoft that's basically used to score the text and the sentiment here, and to give me that score. Once I have a score, I'm using an open extension to store that score into the Microsoft Graph here. Things like, just basically my score. So this way I can retrieve it later. The last one here I have is, actually the get user. That's gonna give me the score for the current user. And the way it works is I still get the last 10 messages here. But by default, you get 10 messages. For each of those messages, I get, if I have one, my extension, and I get the data associated to that. I can sum up all that, I just do a basic average here, and I return that value to the consumer. That's all I do here. So that's the part for the Azure function. Now let's dive into the SharePoint Framework web part. So this is a basic SharePoint Framework project here. Nothing super different. The only things I did here are first in the config section, you need to make sure that you actually request the scopes you need here in the manifest, because this is going to drive your deployment sequence here for the packages, and as well, and my password expired. So the packages that you're uploading here effectively, and you can allow, and that's going to drive this other new list, which is in the preview portal for SharePoint. That's going to ask if you to the administrator, to the tenant administrator, if it's okay or not to talk to those external services. So for each and every package that comes in with those requests, they are going to get here a new request for talking to those different services. So those are the two things, and keep in mind that for example matches with the application name I had in the Azure portal. Yeah, once you have that, you can actually leverage in the nice service here. Same idea as my application, right? Like and the URL of my Azure function here, and I can leverage the Azure ID, Azure Active Directory HTTP client to talk to my Azure function, but also the MS Graph client to talk to my Microsoft Graph. And this is here how you register a webhook. You just say, okay, I want to subscribe on things that were created, things that were updated, and I want to things to subscribe on the messages of the current user, and that's going to expire in so much time. And this is my secret state, and here's how I create my thing. So now let's jump to the demo. The demo is actually super simple, and you'll see why I'm a developer and not UX designer. Here's our wonderful web part here. I'm gonna remove the breakpoints. I'm gonna refresh the page. So what it's actually doing here, it's actually calling my API to, if it shows up at some point. Yes, it's actually calling my API to, like the one we talked about, get user, to get the score of the user, which in its turn calls the graph to get the 10 last emails, which calls the extensions on those emails to make sure that, well, to get the score, and that was populated by the hour function, that was populated by the webhook notification, and this is how this whole system sits together. Let's try with a new mail. So I'm going to send another email to this test email address with a bad sentiment analysis here. And in a couple of minutes, you should see that score decreasing. It's not instantaneous because the webhooks, one of the things you have to know is they can deliver the notification to your system almost whenever they want. And they do that first because they don't want to DDoS your system, but second also because they want to protect their system to make sure that they are not spending all the energy talking to different APIs and not actually handling user requests. So it's never instantaneous. So let's refresh one time. Here is the updated value on the web part. A few questions I thought you guys might ask before we conclude is, as this is a government city, what can you use as government employees? So Azure Functions are GA, so general availability for US government deployment. However, you don't have any consumption plan, so you have to leverage an app service plan instead, the one that you plan the size for. And you don't have a portal experience for the functions yet. For the Microsoft Graph, it's also GA on US Gov deployments. It, however, depends on a few restrictions, things like how the registrations of the applications are set up for your tenant, the Graph Explorer is not supported, and so on and so forth. And SharePoint Framework is GA, at least some of it, and you have a few particularities that are related to that when talking to the graph in APIs and so on and so forth because of these other restrictions. And in terms of conclusion, so we could see that my demo scenario was very simple, but we have endless possibilities, and it lowers the development entry, the barrier to entry, and the integration costs, and so on and so forth significantly. It allows you to effectively focus on the business value and make sure that you deliver actual value for the company and not spend too much time on technical stuff. And what it means in effectively is better productivity for you, and better productivity for you means at the end of the day, hopefully better productivity for the users. That means you're more money made or money saved for the company. And this is usually the argument I start with when I want to convince my boss. Thank you very much for attending today. Here's my contact. I'll put up the slides in a couple of hours. Feel free to ask any questions, and have a good day.